actually say, no, I can't write everything, or what does everything mean? What does the term everything mean? When we say no concept, what does that no mean? Where does the no come from, right? And these are basic, I think, fundamental, even boring and banal philosophical questions that need to be asked again and again whenever we're discussing the relationship between thinking, speaking, writing, being silent, and the making of art. I mean, I am, again, I tend towards austerity in thinking, and I tend towards a Wittgensteinian sort of injunction that whereof we cannot speak, we must remain silent. Lurking behind the book again remains another favorite conceit, which comes up again and again in the making of the book itself. Chus Martinez talks about, she invokes Borges's preface to the works of Boi Casares, another Argentinian writer, where Borges says that the future of literature consists in the making of detective novels. And she makes a very interesting observation on the difference between facts and clues, right? Facts and clues. And that's, for me, an interesting way of thinking about the non-object of the documenta, the thing that I have not seen. So I can, I mean, like a policeman appearing on the scene of the crime that he has not witnessed but has to reconstruct, not from the facts of the case, but from the clues which are presented to me in this 800-page book, I can begin to veer towards a certain kind of hypothesis about the criminal and about the crime. And I think that the crime is what is the fantasy of the total library. So for an exhibition that says that it has no concept, it actually overprivileges, in some very fundamental sense, the vanity of discursive comprehensiveness by saying it doesn't need to produce structure because structure is inherent in the brain of the curator, which is present somewhere implicit in the... Now, Borges's total library, for those of you who know, appears as a figure in two particular cases. One is a short essay called The Universal Library, and one is a work of fiction called the Library of Babel or something like that. And it basically consists of a figure or a trope that says the universe can be reduced to all the books and all the pages and all the information in an unending series of rows. And the librarians of the total library, whom Borges actually talks about, are all going mad. They're all suffering from this kind of ectropic, excess of the organized disorganization of the principles of the library. In a commentary on Borges's library, the mathematician Quinn, W.V.O. Quinn, who's a logician and mathematician, said that anything that makes a claim to comprehensiveness and totality, even when it says it's not making the claim. And this is the paradox. It says no concept, and no concept actually mean everything is, in a sense, implicit in that no concept null set. Anything that says that can be ultimately reduced in binary notation to just two figures. So you could have the entire 800-page book reduced to a dot and a dash, Morse code, or 1 and 0. Because the combinations of dots and dashes or ones and zeros can produce effectively every word and every phrase in the entire conceptual armature of the world. So in a sense, that moment of sort of zero-sum confrontation with the inability to speak and the valorization of that inability to speak, which can be presented as redemptive on the one hand, can be presented as disabling on the other. And I think that's the crux of the paradox of this documenta, that what is disabling is what is also probably enabling. And that has something to do with curare, the poison that also enlivens you, which might have something to do with curation. So I'll end there. There are other things that we can talk about, such as the fact that I don't think you need to go to Kabul to see Afghanistan. It's present in Germany, but that we can talk about later.
Thank you very much. Please stay on stage, Shuddhu, and can we ask everybody else who has spoken this morning to come up? We have, I think, 10 minutes for discussion. You're able to keep your sugar lows at bay. Jibesh? Sonia? Vidya? So, questions from the House, if there are any, or questions between the speakers, if there are any. I was wondering, I was wondering, Shuddho, by the kinds of things that you were invoking, whether you weren't then sort of producing or reproducing for us this documenta, not as some sort of an urgent political act, but really producing it as a kind of a game. Because that affectation of the no concept then actually leads the audience to struggle to find the concept, and having recuperated the concept, just like, the meteorite is dug up, you feel triumphant about having just found that, and you rest at that level. Yeah. If you like, but are there questions in the House?
Games are deadly serious things.
Yes?
And they have urgent political implications. Because games are very deadly serious thing, and they have urgent political implications. If you look at the history of Cold War politics, it was actually theorized by in game theory terms by mathematicians. And this trying to make sense of the unknowable, trying to make wagers on the unknowable, and then finding a slice or a corner of the unknowable and transforming it into a stable object of knowledge, and making claims for what is ephemeral in the terms of a far longer duration, sometimes eternity, have political consequences. I think part of what Jibesh was trying to say in my hearing of it had to do with this kind of moves that one makes in the alternative cycles between progress, catastrophe, emptiness, exhaustion, renewal. And these can be thought of as moves in a game. And then the documenta is... No, that's fine. But what I'm saying is that a documenta or an exhibition, for me, is not so much the game as the set of instructions for how you play the game. And that has longer term implications.
Okay. Now, as always happens in JNU, the first question is from Sai Baba. Please. We have our own rules for our own games here.
Congratulations. I am Sai Baba. Actually, very meaningful input by all the presentations. Especially Jibas is saying the catastrophe, that in Finnish and German terminology, it is a disaster. What do you mean by the Hitler doing the Jewish? Whether it is a disaster or catastrophe, whether it's tragic things. And my observation is like that, you are making more interpretation in the cognitive, psychological, neurological orientations. I really appreciate this one. And in my notes also, written notes, I mentioned A+ for you. And
what? Oh, okay. Thank you. I think on behalf of the panel, I can thank you for that. Yeah, that's excellent. If they come back in another 10 years, maybe an honorary degree. Okay.
There is a historical problem. It has been said as a catastrophe moment it was. You see Nightingale, I don't know some writing, you can say that there is no poetry possible after. It is not that, I'm not saying that it was not a catastrophe. I'm saying the capacity to generalize from there to everything. A bomb dropping in Cambodia, so you see the problem. Now if you're doing that, you have to do a lot. That was not possible to do, before. Because, whatever said about Gayatri Spivak, there is one thing that she always insisted on non-identity of events. So teleologically, if you kind of move, like you have a she says that progress distributes itself teleologically. Now the thing is, if you start doing this identity of even Adorno, he has this complete sense of non-identity between theory and practice. There is always this kind of suspicion of the kind of totality, though he's always trying to grapple with it. And if you lose that sense, and if you start making this kind of identities of events around this, around the kind of analogous feel of the object, then it's a bit confusing. And I think there is a kind of historical record being produced. It is being produced. It is through the idea of catastrophe and closure of any agency, and the idea of agency is a withdrawal idea that you will heal yourself now. So an interspecies healing, the nature is healing. So the system, that Darwinian system that is being produced, the eddies around it, there are some work, I'm not saying even Camp's work is interesting, it just plays around it, it takes that system, seriously looks at another eddy. And that is kind of done away with as a concept, as a problem, as a provocation. You know, even see someone as sharp as Gita is seduced by the dance. Criticality, it is very seductive, and she's pretty sharp about this, you know, like. But you know that ability that history is collapsed to a certain degree in which there is identity being brought between things and does away with any other possibility. And I think it should be good, it's good because it has precipitated itself. But we need to work on it further.
Jibesh, you keep talking about catastrophe and then directly the process of healing. I'm not sure that, and by saying it often enough, you know, I also started to, as you were saying, either get seduced, I also got seduced into thinking that perhaps this was the recourse, healing. But it's not entirely, it's not as if a documenter or whatever exhibitions like this do not offer other alternatives.
Absolutely.
For instance, there is also offered the expression of mourning within, you know, through the works or a lament, or perhaps a healthy one. It isn't always healing that is the
No, I'm just drawing a relationship between a certain strand. I said it's
but I think the
unauthored.
strand can also contain these.
Yeah, you have to draw other strands. But as I said, the matter, a different conception of matter is emerging, which is very important to emerge. Different ontological questions are emerging. But I'm saying that there is a question around catastrophe which can't be passed in silence. In 15 minutes, I think that one, and another 15 minutes would have been something else.
Okay, we now have 3 questions lined up here, Parul, Gayatri and Ranjini. And I'm afraid in interest of time, we'll just take these 3 and let the panel respond and break.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. Your critique of the documenter publication, I find it so ambivalent because you start off by, reading out theoretical concepts in this kind of way, that is, not in concept. At the same time, you take it as a certain kind of overprivilege of what you say, the vanity of discursive anchorage. And then end by saying that anything that is disabling is also enabling. So it really turns your critique into some kind of invalidation.
Could you give the mic to Gayatri? No, let's take all 3 together.
This is for Jibesh, and thank you for that seductive argument, if that is certainly the trope within we are looking at this. You brought us to a point and then you left it where you talk about, you certainly lay out the teleological structures of catastrophe, but then you leave it at the juncture of healing. And this is, I think, an interesting sort of a provocation. What could be the possible teleological structures embedded in the exhibition for healing? For instance, what would they be? Testimony, congregation, confession, mourning has already been mentioned by Sonia. And the tantamount equivalence of these to the book, and of course the book that comes to mind here is biblical. The entire European model being based on something like what is the extraction from biblical history is of course healing. Is that somewhere within the teleological structure a possibility, or do you feel it never reaches that far?
No, this is a quick question for Jibesh. That was a great provocation. And I just wanted to ask you, because at some point it seemed like you almost suggested that hedonism was one of the responses to catastrophe. And that did not really fit into the overall way in which you were dismantling certain kinds of teleologies. So I just want a clarification on that. Because as someone who's really interested in hedonism as an interesting kind of response, it seemed kind of odd that it's sitting here as a generalized response to catastrophe.
Okay, I'll just see, there are a lot of therapeutic move in documentary. There are very levels of therapeutic. So one is that if you become aware of various forces that are passing through you, you will get healed or become more aware. That's the kind of reading. A friend of mine says very nicely about contemporaries that there is ruling class needs Zen Buddhism and workers have Protestant ethics. So it's a kind of, like the healing seems to be there's the idea of stress and there is the idea of overwork. The healing seems to be as if you can find balance through the self in a certain therapeutic form, and that could be drawn from shamanism, that could be drawn from different therapeutic traditions. But my problem is that healing, when art starts going into that terrain, you are entering a very interesting proposition. Is that, the relationship between the community and the symbolic exchange between the community and the person. In the form of labor and the movement in which art is produced today, I am not so sure that those fictions are powerful. A shaman, like shaman or someone, that fictions are no longer powerful. I was discussing with Daniela that this whole Shakti Pithas, Shakti Pitha is what? 56 angs of body parts of Sati. They're all sites of sacred thing and blessing. So there's a catastrophe, a saving of almost a catastrophe, and which leads to this dismemberment of Sati, and it all becomes sites of blessing. Now how do we rethink that? So I would say that we have to draw the animist tradition in, we have to do a lot of work. Just through the blessing and healing, we don't do justice to a very, very complicated way in which landscapes, ecologies are produced and imagined and actually relate. I'm just a little wary of this artist, this kind of ontological community given in the world in which actually the question of community has to be produced. So in that sense, I'm a little wary of this unexamined. See, I didn't say, I said there is a relationship between...
As an aesthetic proposition, rather than social meaning. But it was as if whether there is an aesthetic proposition embedded in it.
There was no aesthetic proposition. Actually, I didn't see it. If some would have seen it, I didn't see aesthetic proposition. I thought more sociological. The person that is coming to it is a sociological person.
Do you want to jump in now? Are there questions? Yes. No, we're not taking more questions. Not taking.
See, hedonism, I just said it as a form in which a lot of critique of the political is produced through the critique of hedonism. In that sense, I was saying. So you think that I'm not saying that inhabiting hedonism. You would say that, okay, I'm critique hedonism, I critique megalomania. So I'm producing this distance from I'm rereading the catastrophe, rereading the political. In that sense, I'm saying. So it is a kind of, a lot of battles that have been fought in the 20th century intellectually is kind of brought into some strange stasis. That is what I felt. And I think there is a lot of other things that are going on. I'm just saying that when Gita said, this is something that I would like to put into some discussion, because this has a bearing on the way we all will be thinking through the larger questions. Because already in a 2 trillion economy, actually you will be doing, a lot of artists will be working today. And then the historical question can't just disappear.
Can I just say something which is not the brief I gave myself in the first presentation was literally to pose the problem or the proposition that the documenta has developed for itself, at least in the past 4 documentas and possibly earlier, but certainly a strong compulsion to declare one's position about the state of the world and to find both expositionary forms as well as discursive forms to defend that position. Now, just for myself and the way the questions have been sometimes negotiated through me because I made the brief for this seminar, I'd like to just simply put my own place, I place myself within the kind of discourse that has been generated this morning, and I think it's an extremely rich discursive space that has been opened up, and the kind of questions which are not expected to have any form of conclusion. But I did want to insert myself into this as somebody who thinks through both exhibitions and discourse, that if
if there is an element of seduction, when there is, it is to do with two forms, that is rhetoric and entropy. That quotation about the dance is, as you mentioned about the entire book, but encapsulated in that, there is a rhetorical mode. Caroline from day one took a rhetorical mode about the exhibition. So it was based, and it has all the conceits of rhetoric, and so not this is a way, of course, in a sense, of claiming that there is, as you said, the structure of the mind of the curator is actually configuring the not this. Now, alongside what Jivesh talked about so prominently, the catastrophe, I would say that rhetoric and entropy, in actual fact, in this particular documenta, but possibly as a paradigmatic relationship between rhetoric and entropy, might be proposed. And I think that the seduction here would have to do with an ontological identification with these two tropes, not the actual fact of how the world is going, but these two tropes. So let us take them as tropes and not as statements about the world, these two forms, these two tropes of rhetoric and entropy. But in my case, I would always, and this is where we would probably have a contestation, I would always bring in the historical, and I will always say that I speak of conjuncture and of a combustive conjuncture now. And that combustive conjuncture is the historical, which actually she was parrying all the time. So that is why it was important to recall Aucuit. In actual fact, both Catherine David and Aucuit, but Aucuit more often, who now, if you see the contents list of Aucuit as against Catherine David's and as against Caroline's, is completely pedagogical. So in actual fact, he was addressing history in the most utterly pedagogical mode of a post-colonial consciousness. And finally, you speak about the epistemology that comes out of the book, or the kind of discursive evacuation, discourse to the extent of an evacuating of the issues in Jivesh's case, that the discourse in some sense is so excessive that it actually does not address the questions that escape that discursive mode. I would personally bring to it an old-fashioned term like hermeneutics, so that we are talking in terms of recovering a certain kind of epistemology through hermeneutics. So what I'm trying to say is that we can complicate the exhibitionary and the discursive within the documenta exhibition by close description and one by the speculative modes, and I have wanted to put my speculative mode into it.
Parul, thank you for your question, because I think it actually connects to the heart of the matter and also to the preceding conversation. The question of disability and enabling is always, I think, and that's why I quite deliberately left it open, because I think these are questions of degree and whether they are applied in homeopathic or other modes. And I mean this with a certain degree of seriousness, because again, to go back to my old-fashioned, my prior formation, if you look at the dictum, physician, cure thyself, cura te ipsum, which is what Jesus says to his disciples when they challenge him asking for miracles. He says, go cure yourself first before you doubt me. It's in Luke, I think. The problem for me is, and I would like to relate this to the question of trauma and healing in this exhibition, and the evocation of sites of trauma in this entire formation. And I'm speaking in this context specifically of what I've read in the book. And let's say, the question of Afghanistan, which is an interesting problem. And the book actually has a very fine text by Maryam Ghani and Ashraf Ghani, which constructs a lexicon of Afghanistan, brings to my mind, and its method of constructing a hyperlinked lexicon reminds me of the lexicon that we constructed for the Digital Commons for Documenta 11 as a book. And there are many such parallels between different kinds of bookmaking exercises. But let's take the question of Afghanistan. the question of Afghanistan and the question of the crises of the world in general are throughout many of these exhibitionary practices sometimes a mode of invoking the problem and then deriving a certain sense of comfort from having invoked it, right? If we take Afghanistan, let's say, is Afghanistan something that happens between the Hindu Kush and the Panjshir mountains? Or is Afghanistan also present as a reality in, let's say, at the heart of Germany in Kassel? And if you look at the lexicon of Afghanistan that Miriam and Ashraf Ghani have produced, you actually find many of these connections. And as someone who has been to both Kabul and to Kassel, I know that there is a very long history of relationships between, let's say, Germany, Central Europe, and Afghanistan. The central form of Kabul as a city, the planning form was produced by German engineers based on Karlsruhe and so on and so forth. The enterprise of modernity coming into Afghanistan is very much, in some senses, German invention, and in a collaboration with German cultural and intellectual elites. And of course, the fact that at least for the last 35 years, Germany has had a strong presence of the Afghan refugee, who is a complicated figure. In the town of Kassel, if you go to buy Coca-Cola or something, you often deal with these Afghan refugees, and anyone who speaks Urdu or Hindustani ends up having conversations with the long history of Afghan immigration in Germany, the long history also of Germans' martial presence in Afghanistan, which is not just limited to this particular conflict. I mean, there are many young women and men who are German who have actually served in Afghanistan. And in some ways, you could say that the question of Afghanistan is central to an understanding of the deep structural crisis within Europe and Germany. Now, in this case, the healing question, and that's why I'm saying it's a question of degree. The problem is proposed prognostically, but how it is dealt with diagnostically is a very different question, where it gets displaced onto those other people there who can then be put in the hospital, right? Whereas actually there might be a kind of contagion which the curatorial response uncannily perhaps senses but is not able to respond to. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. Thank you very much. And with that, we'll close for lunch. I believe it's 1:30, am I correct? 1:45. Okay, so we need 45 minutes for lunch, so let's meet at 2:30. Thank you very much.